Hi, everyone. We are going to get started today. So, thank you so much for joining our webinar this evening. Our speaker this evening is Amy Laurent. Amy is a developmental psychologist and a registered pediatric occupational therapist. She is currently in private practice and specializes in the education of children with autism spectrum disorders and related developmental disabilities. The majority of Amy's work involves collaborating with and supporting early intervention teams, school teams, and families. Her consultative services focus on the creation of educational programs and environments that facilitate children's active engagement and learning at home, in schools, and throughout their communities. The SERTS model, of which she is a co-author, along with differentiated instruction and developmental theory, guide her practice. Amy is an adjunct faculty member for the Department of Psychology at the University of Rhode Island. She teaches courses focused on developmental psychology. Previously, she has served as an adjunct faculty member for the Communication Disorders Department at Emerson College and at the University of Rhode Island. In these roles, she's developed graduate courses focused on preparing clinicians to meet the needs of children with autism as well as the needs of their families. Amy's current research interests involve examining the relationship between characteristics of young children diagnosed with autism and strategies used by parents to support them within the context of natural routines and play. Her publications focus on social communication and emotional regulation in individuals diagnosed with ASD. She frequently lectures and provides training throughout the United States and internationally on the SERTS model and other topics related to therapeutic and educational intervention for children with ASD. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amy.
Excellent. I always feel like I should say, like, I like to take long walks on the beach and like with my dog. I don't know after I listen to my introduction. Okay, how's that?
Good to go.
Good? Awesome. Thank you, thank you. All right, yeah, so our goal today is to do a really abbreviated introduction of emotional regulation as a developmental construct and how it influences the availability for learning and interacting for all of us, and then for your kiddos with PMS as well, or Phelan-McDermid Syndrome. So I think I don't want to spend too much time going into depth about my background, because we've already done that already, but let's just say this is kind of my sweet spot. This is what I really love, and this is where a lot of my effort and energy in terms of my research and my practice happens on a daily basis. And actually, I was just texting with a girlfriend before I hopped online, and I think most of you probably know, but maybe not all, and this is actually a good time to bring it up, and we'll see some supports later on. I have a website, which is actually my name. It's amy-laurent.com. And the reason I was texting with my friend back and forth is about once a month, I put up a new support and send it out to my mailing list. But it's free and downloadable to anybody who goes on the website. That's why having the address is a good thing, amy-laurent.com. But this month's support is all about regulation, and it's really exciting because it's developed in conjunction with an autistic adult, and I'm super excited about it. And she was like, when is the support going out? And I was like, after I'm done this lecture about regulation. So I know that Jackie's got a couple questions that she can throw out there for us, just to give me an idea of who's on the phone. I know we're a pretty small group this evening, but it's always helpful for me, since you know a little bit about me, to get a little bit more information about who you are. So the first questions, and Jackie can go ahead and pop those out there. All right, great. So that's awesome. So most of you are familiar with SERTS. There's a few of you who aren't. So just to give us a little bit of a background, SERTS is an acronym, because you have to have an acronym when you're working in educational models. And so the acronym stands for social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional support. So the first webinar that Jackie was referring to, we focused a lot on just a very basic overview of the model, but more so on the social communication profiles of the individuals in our lives and trying to figure out how sophisticated they are within our partner stages of the model. So we have social partners, which are before words, our pre-symbolic students and learners, emotional regulation, which is the part we're going to talk about tonight. But our next level is our language partners, which are emerging language kiddos. And then our last level is conversational partners. So those are individuals who have fairly robust vocabularies and can have a back and forth in conversation. So in our last time together, we focused on communication, we focused on those 3 language levels, and tonight we're really going to focus on the regulation piece, which will set us up for the third part, which is our transactional support, which is how do we team with students' educational teams to be able to provide kind of wraparound support and full contextual learning for individuals. So again, that first webinar, if you didn't hear it or weren't part of it, that the social communication is the strongest focus. And so today we're really focused on the emotional regulation piece. I do have a few slides in here just to remind us of some very basic premises of SERTS, because I think they're really important to make sure that we're well grounded in some basic understanding of the framework. And one of the most important things for us to know is, and this will come out as we're talking about regulatory strategies or strategies to support regulation today, is that SERTS is a framework. So it really does incorporate many other evidence-based educational practices. So it's not an us versus them. It's not you do this model and you don't do something else. It's if there is a strategy that helps support a student's regulation and there's an evidence base behind it, we can pull it in at the appropriate developmental level, and you should see that tonight. So a lot of times, if families are going to teams and saying, "Are you familiar with SERTS? Are you aware of it?" And sometimes teams will be like, "I don't want to add something else in." It's really nice to just be able to say, "This isn't so much about adding something in, as it is about organizing the educational practice." So the framework's in place so that we know that we have a roadmap to move that student or my student forward in a way that makes sense from a developmental standpoint. And we can pull all those strategies in that you're using with them, but in a really systematized way to make sure that we're getting our most bang from our buck with our educational efforts. So again, just really keep that in mind as we talk tonight, is that SERTS is a very inclusive practice. I did say last time when we were on the call, I know that we do draw the line at a couple places, because we do, because one of our primary objectives within the context of SERTS is that individuals are going to be spontaneous functional communicators at whatever developmental level they are. So whether they're pre-symbolic, not using words at all, so just some gaze, gestures, facial expressions, vocalizations, those types of things, we still want them to be spontaneous and functional in their communication. Therefore, discrete trial training does not work within the context of the SERTS model to develop communication, because if you're using that kind of traditional discrete trial training, our child is always in that respondent role, and we're not able to foster spontaneity. So it's just clearly a mismatch of our end goal, spontaneous, functional, initiated communication, and a teaching strategy that puts a child in a respondent role. You can't get there. The teaching strategy doesn't support that actual type of objective of being obtained. So that doesn't fit within the context of the model. And then I think the other thing that I said that doesn't fit within the context of the model when I spoke to you all last time was that approaches that view the educational professionals as experts and families kind of as being recipients of knowledge are not consistent with SERTS. We really view families as being extremely knowledgeable and probably the most knowledgeable about their children. And so we invite families to partner with us. And so it's a very much a team-based approach, as opposed to a, hey, let us tell you what we think is best for your child. Of course, we're going to have a conversation. We'll bring our expertise to the table, but we're hoping that you will do the same as well, and that it really truly does become a true partnership. But outside of those two educational practices, pretty much anything else that has an evidence base, as long as we're getting at the right developmental level, fits within the context of our model. Okay. So I mentioned this already, so I'll just talk about it very, very briefly. We have social partners, which are pre-symbolic students. we have our language partners and our conversational partners. Now, what's critical about this is that, and we talked a little bit about this the last time as well, is developmental age or developmental level and chronological age can be two entirely separate things, right? So we can be working with students or children in our lives who are important to us, who we care about and love, who might be teenagers, young adults, who are function as social partners, so they're not using symbols to communicate. Or we may be working with younger children who do have some symbolic communication. So that's our emerging language stage, our language partner. So you can kind of cross these levels regardless of age. I think the next question, Jackie, I'll have you just pop it up now just to get a sense of the age range of your kiddos in your lives. So I have a sense of who's represented here today. Awesome. So we've got quite a range. We have no littles, but we have a lot of elementary students, some of our middle school, early high school, and then we've got some adults represented as well. Fantastic. Okay. So and these strategies and what we talk about, because we're talking about developmental levels, what's most important is you identify what developmental level the individual in your life is at, social, language, or conversational partner, because that's going to inform how we move forward with our intervention. So this particular slide, and I know I didn't clarify this with Jackie before we got on the call, but if I know she's going to make slides available to people. So if you don't have a handout already, those are going to be available to you. And if you have it already, that's fantastic. But take a look at this particular slide when we're done, and just make sure that you feel really comfortable and confident, regardless of the chronological age of the individual you're caring about, excuse me, with Phelan-McDermid, figure out which partner stage they function at, because that's going to help put the context for the rest of the slides that we move forward with. Okay. Sometimes, there we go. So when we talk about emotional regulation, we're really talking about a developmental construct, okay? And when we talk about a developmental construct, we're talking about what underlies and supports our availability for learning and engaging. And so this is my friend Mike. He's a young man with autism, and he is doing something that many of us really don't like to do on a biannual basis. Is that right? So twice a year, we typically put ourselves in this situation that most of us don't really enjoy. And it involves kind of being put in a vulnerable position and people invading your space and touching you and all sorts of sounds and smells that you're not typically exposed to. He's waiting for the dentist. Now, some people love the dentist. My college roommate was one of them. It was like the best day of her life when she got to go to the dentist. But for a lot of us, going to the dentist can be a high anxiety time, or at least slightly distressing for some of us. And Mike is waiting for the dentist here in this particular photo. And if you look at him, he is doing a lot of things while he's waiting, which is really important, because so many times we tell students and we tell kids to wait, but we don't teach them how to wait. And we all do things when we wait, and we kind of lose sight of that. So if you look at him, you'll see that he's got headphones on, right? And we would consider that, in the context of the model, a behavioral strategy for regulation. He's getting sensory motor input, very much like the fidget toy has in his hands. Also, sensory motor input for the purpose of regulation. So that's the behavioral strategies. Those are young, early developing strategies. He also has some other supports with him waiting for the dentist, and you see he's got a timer there, so that visual fading red timer, which tells him how long he's waiting. And at the top of that timer, he's got a picture of the dentist, so he knows what he's waiting for. And that's an extremely important thing, right? Because that provides predictability, and predictability is really organizing and regulating. So this information, how long I'm waiting and what I'm waiting for, in and of itself is regulating and settling for Mike. And if you just think about in your own daily life an experience where you didn't know how long you'd be waiting. So like you got called back to a doctor's office and you got put in an exam room and the door shuts and then your appointment time comes and goes and then 10 minutes comes and goes and 20 minutes comes and goes, and like most of us, when that time keeps passing and we don't know how long we're waiting, our arousal levels start to increase. It's uncomfortable. That unpredictability is uncomfortable. So when we have something like a timer and a picture that shows us what we're waiting for, that helps settle us and organize us because there's that predictability built in. The other thing that Mike's got in this particular picture waiting for the dentist is he's got a schedule on his lap, and that schedule details all the steps from leaving his house to leaving the dentist's office. So we would consider that a within task schedule within the model. So it gives him lots of sequential information, right? So he's got these 2 behavioral strategies, sensory motor strategies, the fidget toy and the headphones, and he's got 2 language-based strategies that are providing him with information. So the timer and the schedule. Now, the other thing that's not quite as clear in this picture, but it's really important, is he's in the most popular chair in the dentist's office, which was actually donated by his family, and I'm sure some of you can relate to that. He's in a rocking chair. And the reason I say the most important chair in the dentist's office is because the receptionist says this chair is never empty, right? That people are always sitting in it. And what that says to us is rocking, right? Rhythmic vestibular input is soothing to the central nervous system. And that's true for pretty much all of us. And in times of anxiety or stress or high arousal, that is soothing and comforting, and it's something we seek out. And it always makes me laugh when I'm flying through kind of the major hub airports these days, is you see these banks of rocking chairs everywhere in like the central hubs, and there are people who are literally standing behind columns waiting to get in one of those chairs. It's like they're stalking the chairs, right? And I always kind of giggle and then shake my head at the same time, because if you're in a wooden frame that rocks, it becomes a really desirable, soothing input to rock, and you want to do it. It's something you want to be a part of. But if you went to a crowded, busy gate and you saw somebody rocking in a static chair, you would think there was something amiss, something was wrong. What's up with that person, right? And what is always baffling to me is if the chair moves, it's okay and you want to do it. And if the chair doesn't move, you're curious about what's going on for that person and you think they must be really stressed and you're going to give them a lot of space. And so this is when we start thinking about really starting to examine what it is we do as ourselves to regulate and organize ourselves, how much of that's socialized by other people or shaped by other people, and then the types of things that we see our loved ones engage in terms of regulation. So again, when we look at this particular picture of Mike and we say, okay, he's got a rocking chair, he's got headphones, and he's got a fidget toy, he's got a schedule and a timer and a picture of what he's waiting for, he's got a ton of support, right? And I'm sure all of you can relate to this. If you asked Mike's mom, you know, does he really need all of that? She would tell you he absolutely does. At this moment in his life, he needed all of this to be ready for the dentist. And if he didn't have it and it wasn't in place and he couldn't access and use it, the dentist would be ready for him and Mike would be up and pacing around and not ready for the dentist, and the appointment probably wouldn't happen. So mom's reaction is always like, well, what would the alternative be? It wouldn't be good, right? We wouldn't accomplish it. Now, within the context of SERTS, one of the things that's really important to say is Mike in this picture is a language partner. We're using both sensory motor supports and language-based informational supports to support him, right? These supports aren't static for Mike. This is what he needed at this time, but if he starts to be able to use a digital watch, right, as a countdown timer, that time timer is going to go away and we're going to shift to a watch. We probably will always keep the headphones because let's face it, we all listen to music all the time. But if Mike got to a place where he was able to use a sight word vocabulary, that picture schedule on his lap is going to become written words. So we're going to shift and develop as Mike shifts and develops it. But we want to make sure that we're supporting at his developmental level. And he might stay at this level for quite a while before we see change and shifts, which would allow us to shift the support. So just keep that in mind. Like, the level of support is not static, and the types of supports aren't static, but our goal in making sure there's information and predictability and soothing sensory motor input in time of high stress, those goals stay the same. How we accomplish them is going to change depending on the individual and their developmental level and kind of where they are and what the context is at the time. So just like we mentioned the last time, in the context of SERTS, we have a curriculum-based assessment, which is focused on assessing and intervening and helping individuals be more available for learning and interacting to regulate both their emotional state and their physiological state. So I mentioned this curriculum-based assessment in the last webinar is not a curriculum as in like an activity book that you open it up and say, hey, I want to work on this objective. What activities do I need? Our curriculum-based assessment is literally a scope and sequence of goals and objectives where we would observe a child or a student or a young adult or an adult in their natural environments and figure out how they're navigating their day. What skills or abilities do they use to regulate by themselves or in interactions with other people? And what are the next steps? Where do they have opportunities for growth? Then we're going to choose off of that observational assessment those next steps and those opportunities for growth, and that's going to become part and parcel of our educational plan for the student. And we're going to do it within the context of their daily routines. So again, if we look at our regulation curriculum, it really is about increasing availability for learning and interacting, keeping our loved ones plugged in to what's happening in the environment and learning in the context of the environment, engaging in social interactions. Now, if that's our goal, we really have to understand what influences regulation. If I say, if a student is well regulated, they're available for learning and interacting. Okay, and that's regardless of context. So it's in your home context, it's in the classroom, it's in the community. And then you say, okay, Amy, if that's well regulated, you must mean that dysregulated or disorganized is they're not available for learning and interacting, or something's off about the level of their arousal level or their emotional state. So it doesn't match what's happening in the environment, right? So there's a mismatch, and that's true. So this slide gives us an idea if there is a mismatch, if there is dysregulation, some of the things that might be at play. So, and again, this is not comprehensive, but what I love about this slide is it helps me as a partner start to think critically about what could be influencing the child, the individual, the young adult in that moment that I might need to come as a partner to help kind of rectify or change or shift in some way. So you can see things like physiological factors are listed here. So physiological factors are things like health, sleep status, interoception, those pieces where the individuals that we care about kind of struggle with those things often, right? So if a individual in our life, son, daughter, person that we care about doesn't sleep well, we know that they're at greater risk for being disorganized and dysregulated during the day than if they get that solid 8, 10 hours of sleep a day. Doesn't that sound like a dream? But you know, but that's really true. Like, so sleep can be a protective factor or it can be a risk factor. So some of the other risk and protective factors here, having difficulty predicting the actions or events. So going into a situation that's unknown or unfamiliar, that's going to be potential for dysregulation. I have interoception listed here. Sensory processing difficulties, which we know that are part and parcel with Phelan-McDermid syndrome, right? Taking sensory information in from the environment differently than a quote unquote neurotypical person would. So being either overly sensitive to information in the environment, so hypersensitive, or hyposensitive, having that really high threshold that it needs a lot of stimulation to get someone going and to get them to register information from the environment. You know, so oftentimes we think about kiddos with Phelan-McDermid who really need to move, to feel their bodies, to kind of get alert and awake, to engage, to activate those language centers of the brain, right? So that sensory processing difficulties can keep people in a lower state of arousal. It can also have them idle higher in a high state of arousal. But there's a huge, a vast array here. And so this is just a slide that I've put in here to give you some background. If you say, oh gosh, every time we get into swim lessons, right, dysregulation occurs. Their arousal levels are either too high or too low to be actively engaged and participating. I would say, look at this slide, look at this framework and say, what could be at play? Could it be a lack of understanding? Could there be some executive functioning issues? Is there negative emotional memory? Like every time they go to swimming, it's hard for them and they know it's hard for them. So they actually get worked up before they even get into the swimming pool. All of these pieces can be at play. The reason it's so important to consider this is because if we figure out what the actual factor is that creates the difficulty for the individual, that's where we want to intervene. That's where we want to give more support. We can give support in more generic ways as well, but this gives us a ton of information about exactly how we want to provide more directed support. This slide is one of my absolute favorites, and I could spend the rest of our time talking about it together, and I will not, I promise. But I love this slide because if I'm working with an individual, regardless of their age, and I want to understand their behavior. So oftentimes when we say someone's dysregulated, we know that based on how they're interacting, behaving, presenting in their environment, right? And this is where things like challenging behaviors come in to play, maybe disruptive behaviors, loud vocalizations, right? Busybodies, those kind of things. And people often just focus on the action, what they're happening, that loud vocalization or that busybody, and they want it to stop. And I always come and say, I want it to stop, not because I want it to stop, but I want it to stop in the sense of it's taking them out of their availability for learning and engaging. I want them to be available for learning and engaging. So I need to understand why they're engaging in that behavior or that action. So that action, that behavior, whatever it is at the bottom of this slide. But I can only understand that action if I put it in the context of these other 3 A's. So this is the 4A paradigm, and it was actually developed by a neonatologist, not by somebody who worked with children with autism or any other developmental disability or Phelan-McDermid. It's really just helping us understand, to understand behavior, we have to understand context. And so if someone comes to me and says the child's engaging in this behavior, I have a host of questions. And the host of questions stems from these things. So the first is, okay, great, I now know what the behavior is, but I want to know where the child's focus of attention was, or the individual's focus of attention was, and what they tend to pay attention to, right? So if they tend to be more visual learner, or they tend to be a movement-based learner, I want to know that information too. So what were they attending to, and how do they usually attend or learn? I also want to know what their arousal level is. And the arousal levels are really kind of that continuum of biobehavioral states, which range from deep sleep the whole way to extremely dysregulated, high, high, high. So there's 6 of them in kind of the general developmental literature. So starting with asleep, deep sleep, going to quiet and drowsy, then quiet alert, active alert, agitated, and extremely dysregulated. Right? You're like, okay, Amy, that was a lot of information throwing at us, but where's their arousal level? What's that internal energy like for them? Are they low or are they high? And is it a match or a mismatch for the environment? And that's really important, right? Because if we're talking about, a young adult in your life and it's time for them to be at horseback riding lessons, we want that individual to be in an active alert or an agitated state. Now, agitated is not a bad state to be in. All of these states are good. It's just a higher energy level. We equate the word agitated as something bad, but it is not bad. It just means the person is kind of amped up and ready, okay? So to participate in horseback riding, we need energy, right? We need to be physically involved and active. And if you say, my individual that I care about and that I've taken to horseback riding is in quiet alert or drowsy, they're not going to be able to access horseback riding the way we want them to be. So there's a mismatch between the environment and where they should be to actually fully participate. And if you think about that, recess for a younger child, for those of you who are here and thinking about our elementary school students, right? So it's recess. We want kids to be in high states of arousal. Even extreme dysregulation on the playground is a good thing, because that just means they're laughing, hopefully, and having a ton of fun, because any emotion can happen at any arousal state. So like extreme dysregulation is when you're laughing so hard with somebody and you can't catch your breath, and then someone looks at you sideways and then you start laughing all over again. Like that can be extreme dysregulation. It is not always about being really angry or really sad. Those things can be true, but it can also be really over the top happy. So again, these high arousal levels with physically active times are where we want kids to be. But if you have a student or a child in your life that you care about who's in a quiet alert state on the playground, that's the kid who's watching the leaves blow in the trees, or like walking the perimeter of the playground and like, dragging their fingers along the fence. They're not really participating and available for learning and engaging in recess the way we anticipate that they would be, right? So when I say, where's their arousal level? I want to know, what's that internal energy like? And then what's the environmental energy like? And is there a match or a mismatch between the two things? And then the last piece here is the affect, which is basically what's their emotional experience. How are they feeling in this situation, right? And that can be hard if we don't know the individual well, but oftentimes as parents, as grandparents, as caregivers, as teachers of people for a long period of time, we learn to read emotions very well of individuals who might have less traditional emotional expressions, right? I think about some of my good friends and kids that I've worked with for years who like smile regardless of their emotional experience, but like once you know them really well, you know whether it's like a happy smile or it's a fearful smile, right? Like you can start to differentiate those things even though it's still a smile. So all this to say, I need to know their attention, I need to know their arousal level, and I need to know their emotional experience before I start to understand their action. And what's great is if you put all of these things in context, again, it helps us figure out how to intervene. And I often use really simple examples to help people kind of put this in context. But, I was in a preschool, this is a couple years ago, but it's an example that just stands out in my mind. And it was a student who was having a really hard time sitting down for a morning meeting, and they were bouncing all around the room. And invariably, what typically happens after a student's been bouncing around the room for a really long time is one of the classroom staff tends to help to try to get the student to come join the morning meeting and to sit down. And this student was just all over the place. So if you focus on the behavior, you're going to focus on shepherding them over to morning meetings, sometimes giving, physical cues or holding their hand and helping guide them over, and then sitting down with them. And then sometimes you get into the place where they're helping physically support the student who's sitting because they want them to maintain sitting. And I actually said to the teaching staff for this particular student, because they were bouncing all over the place, and I was like, okay, that's the action, but their attention is they seem really focused on like the back of their neck, and their arousal level's really high, and they seem agitated. And I just said to the teaching staff, I'm like, are they tactily sensitive? Is that a new shirt? Could there be a tag in there? And sure enough, there was, and they cut it out, and suddenly the student was sitting still, right? So it went from this behavior that looked problematic and just really disorganized because we were focusing on the behavior, and they were thinking they were going to have to hold this student in their seat, to doing a little bit of detective work. I mean, and again, it sounds like a really contrived story, but it's a really true story. A little bit of detective work to say what could be going on behind this behavior, and suddenly your intervention is totally different. Cut the tag out, and there's no need for this, hand holding, helping escort somebody over, holding them in place whatsoever. So I love this paradigm. Like, so if someone, if you get a report home from a teacher or, an adult service staff, and they say, oh, so-and-so had this, behavioral challenge today, or was engaged in this, or they seemed really disorganized, I would ask these questions, right? Where was their attention? What's their arousal level? Like, what's their affect? Because then we can start to figure out, is there a different way to intervene to provide support? Because again, this whole idea is when we think about dysregulation, people often focus on challenging behaviors. And this is a quote from a woman with autism who's just brilliant and wonderful. And if you ever have the chance to hear Roz Blackburn speak, I highly, highly recommend it. But she's got this great quote that says, you know, if behavior were the issue, this would be no different than naughty child syndrome. And I'm not a naughty child. Like, there's all these things underlying the behaviors or the challenges that we see that are impeding somebody's ability to be well-regulated, organized, and actively engaged. Which basically leads us to these kind of issues where we always hear, and I say we, me, myself, and my colleagues as educational consultants, things that drive me crazy, where people say, you know, oh, that's just a behavior. He's stimming. He's non-compliant. It's control. He understands everything. He's just trying to get out of it. She doesn't need those. Those things absolutely drive me insane when I hear people say them, because what we know is that children with Phelan-McDermid and children with autism and other neurologically based learning differences have challenges and neurological differences that lead to developmental vulnerabilities that put them at risk for having regulatory challenges. So that web of all those things that I said we need to consider, those are challenges that are part and parcel for neurologically based learning differences. They're true for all of us, but they've become magnified for the individuals in our lives who have these neurologically based learning differences. And so when we say things, or we hear people say things like, he doesn't need that, he's just stimming, he's trying to get out of, they're negating these underlying differences. And what I always try to do is pull it back and say, I hear what you're saying, and we're focused on the behavior. We need to focus on the individual's experience to understand why they're engaging in the behavior. What is at play? How are they experiencing the environment? Then we can start to figure out how we want to intervene. And that helps shift us from this notion of behavior management to emotional regulation. So we're not just going to focus on the observable behavior anymore. We're going to focus on the individual's underlying experience, which gets to that arousal, affect, and attentional pieces that I was talking about. And we're going to move away from just managing the child's behavior, like putting some system in place to tell them what they can't do, basically, which is what management systems do, right? They try to get rid of things or extinguish behaviors. And we're going to move towards regulation, which we're going to try to build and develop skill and capacity. So if you think back to that picture of Mike, there's no token board there. He's not earning as he goes along. He is learning how to use a schedule. He's learning how to reference a timer. He's learning that certain types of music or fidgets and rocking are settling and calming for him. And he's building his own repertoire of strategies of things he can do when he gets in similar situations. And that's what's really important here, is we're building the capacity of the individuals. We're helping Mike have positive experiences so he learns what to do, and he can call in some of those strategies himself, hopefully, or he's receptive to those strategies when people help him access them in the future. So that's really what regulation is about, right? We're building capacity within the individual or within the context of the relationship with the individuals. Okay, so again, we've talked about emotional regulation as a primary domain within the model, and I've alluded to this idea already, but just we'll spend a minute talking about it together here. In the model, it's really, and it's not just in the model, it's in developmental literature in general, there are two capacities that we think about scaffolding. One is self-regulation, what the individual can do on their own to become more available for learning and interacting, to get that arousal level at the right state, so there's a match between the environment. So we're in that active, alert, agitated state on the playground when we're on the playground, and we're in a more maybe quiet alert state when it's like a teacher directed reading activity or something like that, right? That's self-regulation, what you have at your own disposal to make that match, or the individual has at their own disposal to make that match. And then the second capacity is mutual regulation, which is regulation which occurs within the context of an interaction, which means if we're coming to our students, our children, our young adults with support, are they able to access and respond to that support? or are they able to ask us for it? So that's mutual regulation, either responding to support that's offered or asking for support. So self-regulation, what you do on your own, mutual regulation, how you regulate in the context of an interaction with other people. One of the things that's really important to understand about these two capacities is they are very much intertwined with one another. And almost all of our self-regulatory capacities are learned through successful mutual regulatory interactions with other people. So let me say that again. New self-regulation strategies develop based on successful interactions with other people. And just go back to early childhood, typical development. How does an infant learn to use a pacifier? The parent provides it to them over and over and over and over again, to the point where the child goes, hey, this works for me. And by 6 months of age, you see a child reaching around in the crib, picking up a pacifier and putting it in their own mouth, right? So mutual regulation, partner providing it over and over and over again. Kiddo learns this works for them, starts to use it on their own, becomes self-regulation. That's critical. That is a critical teaching piece that I want you all to kind of walk away with, is if we want our students, our children, our young adults, the people we care about, to learn new self-regulatory strategies and to be able to regulate in different ways, we have to teach them how to do it. And it takes time. It is not something that we show one and done. It's repeated exposure and that child having multiple opportunities to learn that strategy and how that's going to work for them. Okay. One of the things that is important to keep in mind is oftentimes, if we think about Phelan-McDermid Syndrome, as well as autism and other neurologically based learning difficulties or developmental disorders, is our students, our kiddos, the people we care about, tend to use earlier developing strategies longer because they don't benefit from the same socialization of strategies in the same way. So they often require more direct teaching to develop more regulatory strategies. So what do I mean by that? So oftentimes young infants flap, right? That's a strategy that we see really common in young children. And what happens is, over the course of time, a young child who's typically developing, and you can't see me, but I'm using air quotes right now because what is typically developing, we're not quite sure. But a child who's really plugged into the social environment and learning in kind of the natural flow of social interactions easily, right? When kids flap, parents clap in front of them. And so by 10 months of age, because they think their kid's happy, right? And so, oh, you're so happy, and they model that clapping. By 10 months of age, most kids aren't flapping anymore. They're clapping because they've been so plugged into that social learning experience, and they're learning based on the models, and they're imitating. So their flapping becomes clapping almost seamlessly without us actually thinking about the teaching that we're doing. For our students who have, developmental disabilities, they often require more direct teaching, that kind of subtle, more modeling with expected spontaneous imitation doesn't happen as easily for them. So that we see things like flapping persist much longer and in the context of development. This is just a really quick visual to give us this idea of self-regulation, mutual regulation. I really love this because this little, I love two things. I love lots of things about this particular slide, but I love that this little guy who is diagnosed with autism is working so hard to stay in this Newsweek photo shoot. So from a self-regulatory perspective, he's only using sensory motor strategies, right? He's got a shirt in his mouth, he's in full extension, he's averting his gaze. Those are all strategies that he's using to stay present. I also love that his sister, who's his younger sister, appears to be going to be a future OT. She's using tons of core central pressure to kind of organize him there, which I think is pretty fantastic and fabulous. And one of the things I love about this too is that there's a lot of support being put in place to get through this photo shoot for both of them, because she doesn't look like she's having a grand time either. A lot of support put in place, and it still doesn't look like they've reached that full level of active engagement, that we're talking about. Like, because if they were actively engaged, we'd think they'd be smiling at each other, smiling at the camera. There'd be some element that they were kind of more present in participating, and neither one of them looked really thrilled to be here. So I like this because it shows us sometimes regulatory strategies are good enough to get us through a difficult situation. Our goal is always that they're going to work to get us to that high place of active engagement, but sometimes we just need something to get through a tough situation, and we need to be honest about that. So I do love that about this slide. One of the things I want to make sure we cover before I open up for questions is the idea of these different developmental levels of regulatory strategies. So I mentioned when Mike was in that photograph, right? And I said he had lots of supports in place. And I said he had behavioral strategies, which were sensory motor strategies. That is our developmentally youngest type of strategy. We all use behavioral strategies, or in your mind, you can call them sensory motor strategies. The developmental literature calls them behavioral strategies, and that's why they're categorized as such within the model. But sensory motor strategies, strategies that give us some sort of input, everybody uses those. So our children who are social partners, regardless of chronological age, again, it could be young adults or adults, social partners use behavioral strategies, sensory motor inputs. Our language partners can start to use language-based strategies. Remember, those are the timers that Mike had, the picture of what he was waiting for, and the schedule. Information strategies that are represented symbolically. Our language partners also use sensory motor strategies. And then the highest level of development within the context of the model are our conversational partners. Now remember, I said conversational partners are those kids who have fairly robust vocabularies and can put novel ideas together, right? So they're creating their own sentences to talk with us, or not necessarily spoken talk, but they could be using augmentative communication, sign language, other picture symbol systems and things. Those individuals might use metacognitive strategies, which are reflective strategies. Those are really high level strategies. To use metacognitive strategies, we would expect that an individual would have the cognitive and language capacity of somebody who's at least 8 years of age, if we think about kind of developmental capacity, typical development. So for our Phelan-McDermid kiddos, most of them were thinking about language strategies and behavioral strategies, right? If we're working with a student or an individual or young adult that is a social partner, we're only thinking about sensory motor supports. And if we're working with somebody who does have some symbolic capacity, we're thinking about language-based supports and sensory motor supports. So I have a few graphics, and if you get the handouts to the slides, you'll see that I've got a few support ideas in here just to give you an idea of what those things actually look like. And so for our social partners, our behavioral strategies can be things like comfort objects. They can be repetitive motor actions like sucking thumbs, flapping, rocking, those types of things. They can also be gross motor movements to get someone up and organized and regulated and attending and alert and engaged. So things like trampolines and swinging and those types of things. One of the things I want to make sure that I highlight, again, before I open up for questions, for social partners, because this is a question that often comes up is, all right, Amy, you said predictability is important for regulation. You said being able to give information is important. But if I'm working with a student or I've got an individual or my son or daughter is a social partner, how do I give information to them if they're not yet processing symbols well, right? We don't know that they're taking in language well to kind of organize and understand the flow of activities. So the schedules and the timers that Mike had might not work. One of the best things that we can do for our social partners, our pre-symbolic kiddos, is to use an object-based schedule. Object-based schedules are amazing at giving that level of individual regulating information, because I'm basically showing you what's going to happen next. It gives information about where we're going and what we're going to be doing. So this is a young boy who's actually transitioning to OT, and the OT is bringing over the bottle of shaving cream to be like, this is what we're doing, we're gonna play together. And my colleague, Emily Rubin, I always love this, she's like, she talks about it as kind of being a vending machine. show them what they're going to do and where they're going to go, right? And kind of lure them to that place, which is really different than kind of a vocal announcing of a transition and taking somebody's hand and leading them someplace, and then maybe not knowing where they're going or why they're going there, but passively coming along. And think about just that from a regulatory standpoint. If you know where you're going and what you're going to do when you get there, and you're kind of following along, you're much better placed from regulation, right? Like you're more organized when you get there than if someone's just taken your hand and led you to a table and asked you to sit down and you don't know what's going to come next. That's that unpredictability piece. So again, object-based schedules are awesome in terms of helping build that predictability and that understanding that we say is so critical for supporting regulation. And again, I love Emily's analogy of you want to be a vending machine. She's always like, you don't want to be a crane. You don't want to pick somebody up and move them to where they're going without them knowing why they're going there or what they're going to do. Don't be a crane, be a vending machine. Give them all the information up front. So again, object-based schedules, really important. What's one of the things that's most important about object-based schedules is if you are using objects, make sure you use the same object to support that individual in your life transition the same way. So like if you're transitioning to lunch every day, make sure you're using the same thing. Like whether you choose as a family or an educational team, a plate or a napkin or a cup, it's always whatever you've decided as a family. Like, right, so if it's lunch is a plate, we're always going to show a plate. It's not going to be a cup one day and a napkin one day and a plate the next. The plate, because what we want to do is start to build the representational understanding that this plate represents this activity. And then we can start to layer some of those language-based supports on it too, right? Like we can put the picture symbol on the plate. So they get the kind of that language-rich, exposed environment, but we're giving like the definition, the plate, actually behind the symbol or the word, which would be the icon or the photograph. So again, I know I've spent a lot of time on this particular slide, but I think it's super important because a lot of times people are really stymied by the, oh, we get that we need to get kids sensory motor supports, which are either soothing or alerting, and based on the environment and whether we need to increase their arousal or decrease their arousal. But when we get to this predictability piece, it can be really difficult for our social partners. So that's why I want to spend a little bit more time on it. The other thing I will tell you is that support that is going out right after I get off this call. So if you go to my website and you download it, there's a page in it that has all the different sensory systems broken up, and it has general strategies, not specific, right? And there's a disclaimer at the bottom that says these aren't going to work for everybody, and you need to think about the individual sensory processing. But the page is broken down by individual sensory systems, all 7 main sensory systems, and then activities that tend to be alerting and activities that tend to be soothing, right? So it's a wonderful resource that you can comb through as family members, share with educational teams to just say, hey, I know that my child reacts really well to visual information. If they're in a situation and we need to increase their arousal, here's some things we might want to think about. Or if we're in a situation and we need to decrease their arousal, here's some things that we could think about. So that is going to be available momentarily for everybody. Okay, so there's our behavioral strategies. There's our object-based schedule, just kind of detailed a little bit more. And then for our language partners, and this is where I'll leave off and open up for a few questions. I know we don't have any time at all, but for our language partners, we're not going to abandon our behavioral strategies. We're going to make sure we're still using those with them, but we are going to bring in things like choice boards, first then boards, picture schedules. That's going to help support their regulation too. So always think about the sensory side of things in terms of helping increase and decrease arousal levels based on preferences and sensory systems. And then also think about how do we provide information that's predictable. If we're working with social partners, we need to use object-based schedules. If we're working with language partners, we can start to bring in more of these symbolic forms, and they can get really quite complicated. I love that I spelled language wrong there. That's hilarious to me. Okay, but in the handout, there's a few more supports and ideas in there that you can definitely take a look at. I know that we've got like 3 minutes for questions, and I'm willing to stay on longer than 3 minutes, but we've got like 3 minutes for questions. So I do want to be respectful of your time, and I will stop here. Again, I know that Jackie's going to make the handouts available to folks if she hasn't already, and there's some additional information in them. So when we meet up next time, hopefully you'll all rejoin us. We're going to really talk about how do we get some of these supports that we've talked about for communication last time and regulation this time in these generalities. We'll dig into a little bit more specifics, but how do we get them across context? How do we make sure what's happening at home also can happen at school, and how do we get that transference of information between different contexts? So with that, I will be quiet until I have a question to look at, or Jackie has a question that she can feed me.
So I don't see any questions. We are at the hour.
And people can always email me too. I do answer emails. Sometimes it does take me a few days to get back to people, but I promise I always answer emails. I know that doesn't necessarily help, other people learn from individuals' questions, or like for the people who watch afterwards, but I will answer individual questions if people email me, which they're welcome to do.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Amy. Again, these slides, the presentation has been recorded, so we'll make that available on the YouTube page probably by the end of the week. And then please join us on June, what did I say, June 30th for the last webinar in this series. So we will round that out. I think the topic is on working with your school and being a partner in that learning process.
Exactly. Awesome.
So thank you all. Have a great rest of the evening. And Amy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jackie. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody else too.